Let them die. Nobody moves without my order, and that is final. Colonel Hargrove turned his back on the drone screen and picked up the phone. Behind him, 480 Marines were being slaughtered inside a valley they could not escape. Burning vehicles, medics bleeding in the open, platoon commanders screaming into radios that nobody at headquarters was answering. Rourke grabbed Hargrove's arm. "Sir, they have minutes, not hours." Hargrove ripped his arm free and shoved Rourke backward into the wall. His voice dropped to something colder than shouting. "Touch me again, and I will end your career before those Marines hit the ground." If you've never heard this story before, stay with me until the very end and drop the name of your city in the comments right now so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what happened next changed the United States Marine Corps forever. The morning of the ambush started the way every dangerous day starts quietly. There was no warning in the air, no unusual movement on the ridgelines, no signal from intelligence that anything was different about this particular valley in southern Afghanistan. Just the familiar smell of dust and diesel, the low rumble of armored vehicles rolling through pre-dawn darkness, and the steady crackle of routine radio communications passing between commanders who believed they were heading into just another stabilization mission. Lieutenant Colonel Ethan Walker rode near the front of the convoy. He was 44 years old, 17 years in the Marine Corps, and he had learned long ago to trust the combination of good intelligence and solid planning over instinct. The intelligence said the valley was low risk. The planning had been thorough. The mission parameters were clear. 480 Marines from 2nd Battalion were going in. They were going to show presence. They were going to make contact with local leadership, and they were going to come out before noon. Walker radioed back to his company commanders as the convoy entered the valley. "Alpha, this is actual. Report status." "Alpha is Lima Charlie, sir. Clear and ready." "Bravo status. Bravo Lima Charlie." "Charlie, Charlie Lima Charlie actual. Everything clean, everything routine." Walker allowed himself exactly 1 second of satisfaction. Then the world exploded. The first burst of machine gun fire came from the northern ridgeline. It was so sudden and so violent that for a fraction of a second, Walker's brain simply refused to process it as real. Then the RPG hit the lead vehicle. The sound was catastrophic, a deep physical concussion that Walker felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. Then the second machine gun opened up from the eastern ridgeline. Then the third from the west. The valley lit up like the inside of a furnace. Contact north, contact north." The radio erupted. "RPG, RPG. Bravo 2 is hit. Casualty, casualty. I need a medic at Bravo 2. Alpha is taking fire from the eastern ridge. We cannot maneuver. I say again, we cannot maneuver." Walker grabbed his radio handset and forced his voice into a register of control that he absolutely did not feel. "All elements, this is actual. Break contact and push to the southern exit." There was a pause, a terrible pause. Then Alpha's commander came back on the net, and Walker could hear the fire in the background, and he could hear the edge of something close to panic underneath the professionalism. "Actual southern exit is covered. I say again, southern exit is covered. We have enemy fighters on the southern ridgeline. We are boxed in." Walker stood in the back of his vehicle and looked at the valley around him. 3 ridgelines. Enemy on all 3. Every exit blocked. Every open space a kill zone. The battalion wasn't in an ambush. The battalion was in a trap that had been designed, built, and laid specifically for them. And whoever had designed it knew exactly what they were doing. Back at Forward Operating Base Falcon, the Operations Center came alive in the way that operations centers come alive when everything is going wrong simultaneously. The drone feed was already up. Major Dennis Rourke, the battalion's operations officer, was on the radio to higher headquarters within 90 seconds of the first contact report. Colonel Hargrove, the brigade commander, arrived 4 minutes later. He took one look at the drone feed, took one look at the map, and did what commanders sometimes do when the situation exceeds what they prepared for. He froze. Not physically. Physically, Hargrove looked like exactly the kind of officer he was: squared away, pressed uniform, the posture of a man who had spent 3 decades being the most prepared person in any room. But mentally, emotionally, in the place where real command decisions get made, Colonel Hargrove froze. Because what he was looking at on that drone screen was not something that fit into the doctrine he had spent his career learning. The battalion was trapped. Every standard option was blocked. Marked. Air support couldn't engage without danger of friendly fire. Ground reinforcement would take hours the Marines in that valley did not have. The situation demanded something outside the manual. And Colonel Hargrove had built his entire career inside the manual. "Get me higher," he said. "Get me Corps on the line." Major Rourke turned from the radio. "Sir, we need to move now. Battalion is bleeding out down there. I am not authorizing any action without coordination from Corps. Sir, by the time Corps responds, we could lose half the battalion." Hargrove turned to Rourke with an expression that contained absolutely no doubt and absolutely no compassion. "Major, I gave you an order. Get me Corps on the line, and nobody moves without my authorization. That is final." The operations center went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has just happened that everyone knows is wrong, but nobody has the rank to say so out loud. Officers exchanged glances. NCOs stared at the drone feed. The radio kept pouring out the sounds of a battle that was getting worse by the second, and Colonel Hargrove picked up the phone to Corps headquarters. It was in that moment, in that silence, that Sergeant Madison Carter looked up from the corner of the operations center where she had been sitting for the past 20 minutes. She had been there before the ambush started. She'd come in to update her range cards, a tedious administrative task that nobody senior ever noticed or cared about, which was essentially the story of Madison Carter's entire deployment. She was supposed to spend this morning doing paperwork. She was supposed to spend this afternoon doing more paperwork, because that was what happened to Sergeant Madison Carter in the Marine Corps. She did paperwork. She was 28 years old. She had graduated from Marine Scout Sniper School in the top 3% of her class. She had the kind of eye for terrain and wind and distance that instructors sometimes go entire careers without seeing in a student. Her range cards were not just accurate, they were works of a particular kind of military art, dense with environmental data, that most snipers never thought to collect organized, with a systematic precision that reflected a mind that genuinely loved the mathematics of long-range shooting. None of that mattered, because Madison Carter was a woman in a job that most of the Marine Corps had not yet fully decided women were allowed to want. She had spent her deployment fighting a battle that never appeared in any official after-action report. It was quieter than the battle in that valley, but in some ways it was more exhausting. It was the battle of being looked at and not seen, of being evaluated and not understood, of raising her hand in briefings and watching the senior officer's gaze slide past her to the male sergeant standing next to her, of being told, sometimes directly and sometimes through the particular silence that's louder than words, that she was an experiment, a political statement, a problem to be managed. Major Rourke had said it to her face 3 weeks into the deployment when she requested to lead a reconnaissance element. "Carter, I'm going to be straight with you. I don't doubt your scores, but this battalion isn't a training exercise, and I can't afford to find out in the field whether your performance translates." She looked at him for a moment. "With respect, sir, every Marine in this battalion was tested in training. I was tested to a higher standard and performed above it. The only variable that's different in my case is..." "That's enough, Sergeant." He'd walked away. She'd gone back to her range cards. But she'd also gone back to her maps. Because the thing about Madison Carter that nobody in 2nd Battalion had ever taken the time to understand was that she never stopped working. While other Marines relaxed in the evenings, she studied terrain maps. She filled notebooks with elevation data, wind patterns, seasonal weather variations, and probable enemy firing positions for every valley within 50 kilometers of the FOB. She built herself a personal intelligence file that was in several respects more detailed than the battalion's official intelligence assessments, because she was looking for things that official assessments didn't prioritize. She was looking for the places where a well-positioned sniper could change the entire geometry of a battlefield. She had studied this particular valley 2 weeks ago. She had noted the ridgelines. She had noted the angles. She had done the math on probable fields of fire from each high point and identified the position she would use if she were planning an ambush. She had written it all down in her notebook. She had mentioned it once in a planning meeting as an aside. The officer running the meeting had moved on without acknowledging that she'd spoken. And now, staring at the drone feed on the operations center screen, Madison Carter was looking at an ambush that had been built almost exactly where she had predicted it would be built. She stood up from her corner. She walked to the drone feed monitor. She studied it for 90 seconds with the complete focused attention of someone reading a language they know fluently. Then she walked to the map table and started working with a dry erase marker, circling positions, drawing angles, calculating distances. Major Rourke noticed her. "Carter, this isn't a training exercise. Get back to... Sir." Her voice was quiet and even and absolutely firm. "There are 7 key positions driving this ambush. 2 machine gun nests, 3 RPG teams, 2 command elements coordinating fire. If those positions are disrupted, the ambush loses its coherence." Rourke stared at her. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" "I can reach them from the northern ridgeline spur, sir. Elevation 2,340 meters. I've pre-calculated the firing solutions. I have range cards for every position they're occupying." There was a long silence. "From 2,340 meters. Yes, sir. In those wind conditions, I've been tracking this valley's wind patterns for 2 weeks, sir. I know what they're doing up there right now." Rourke looked at the map. He looked at the drone feed. He looked at Madison Carter. And then he looked at Colonel Hargrove, who was still on the phone with Corps, his back to the room, his voice carefully composed and deliberate, explaining the situation to people who were very far away and in no immediate danger. Rourke lowered his voice. "Carter, the colonel, has ordered no unauthorized action." "I understand, sir. If I can't get him to authorize this, my hands are tied." "I understand, sir." She looked at him with an expression that was not angry and not desperate and not pleading. It was simply clear. "Sir, I want you to understand what I'm telling you. I can reach those positions. I've done the math. I know this valley. And if someone doesn't disrupt that ambush in the next 20 minutes, we're going to lose a lot of Marines." Rourke was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned toward Hargrove. "Sir," Hargrove held up one hand without turning around. "1 minute, Major." "Sir, I have a sniper here who believes she can disrupt." "I said 1 minute, Major." Rourke turned back to Madison. She read his face. She nodded once very slightly, and she started moving toward the door. Rourke said very quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it, "Carter." She stopped. He met her eyes. He didn't say anything else. She understood. She walked out. Outside the operations center in the FOB's dusty morning air, Madison stopped and pulled out her notebook. She opened it to the page she had written 2 weeks ago when she had done the analysis of this valley, and nobody had listened. The page was dense with numbers and angles and calculations. She read through it once quickly with the calm of someone confirming what they already know. Then she closed the notebook and went to get her rifle. She didn't run. Running attracts attention, and she couldn't afford the kind of attention that would put someone between her and the gate before she got through it. She walked with the specific, purposeful pace of a Marine who is going somewhere she is supposed to go, carrying equipment she is supposed to carry, and at a time she is supposed to be doing exactly this. She signed out her rifle. She loaded her magazines with the particular care she always gave to that task, the care that her instructors had told her reflected a professional's respect for the weight of what she was doing. She checked her range cards one more time. She checked her wind data. Then she looked one last time at the operations center building. Inside that building, Colonel Hargrove was still on the phone with Corps. Inside that valley, Marines were dying. And the distance between those two facts was exactly the distance between the person who followed protocol and the person who understood what protocol was actually for. Madison Carter understood what the Marine Corps was actually for. She walked to the gate and told the guard she was conducting an authorized reconnaissance. The guard, a lance corporal who had absolutely no reason to question a sergeant with a sniper equipment, walking out of an FOB in a professional and unhurried manner, checked her ID and waved her through. The ridgeline was 3.2 kilometers away and 680 meters of elevation gain. Madison started climbing. The physical reality of what she was doing hit her almost immediately. The weight of her rifle, her ammunition, her rangefinder, her notebook, and her water pressed down on her shoulders and her knees and her lungs with the honest mathematics of physics, which doesn't care about motivation or urgency or the lives of 480 Marines. You either have the conditioning to climb a mountain under load or you don't. Madison had the conditioning. She had spent her entire deployment maintaining it in the same way she had spent her entire deployment maintaining every other professional attribute, because she had long ago understood that the day she let any of it slip would be the day every person who doubted her would be proven right. She climbed with the steady, rhythmic efficiency of someone who had done this in training so many times that her body knew what to do, even when her mind was somewhere else. And her mind was doing math. 900 meters to the first machine gun position. Wind from the northwest at approximately 12 miles per hour, based on the cloud movement she could observe and the vegetation movement she had tracked in this valley over the past weeks. Temperature affecting bullet drop. Elevation affecting air density, affecting bullet trajectory. Every variable she had calculated in advance in her notebook 2 weeks ago, when nobody was watching and nobody cared. She climbed for 53 minutes. She counted every minute because she could hear the radio on the handset she had clipped to her shoulder, the battalion's frequency, the one broadcasting the uninterrupted sound of a battle getting worse, and every minute was a voice she recognized or didn't recognize, reporting contact or casualties or positions lost or ammunition running low. Every minute was the mathematics of survival being calculated in real time in a valley below her, and the numbers were moving in the wrong direction. At the 40-minute mark, she heard a voice she recognized. Staff Sergeant Delgado from Charlie Company, a Marine she had trained with for 3 months back at Lejeune. Charlie, 3 is cut off. We are cut off. We need fire support. We need it now. Someone tell me someone is coming. She heard the response from the operations center, calm and bureaucratic, because Rourke was a professional, and professionals maintain their composure even when everything is wrong. Charlie 3, we hear you. We are working the problem. Stand by. And then she heard Delgado's voice drop to something smaller and rawer than radio professionalism normally allows. Standing by. Copy that. Just somebody come. She climbed faster. At the 53-minute mark, she reached the spur at 2,340 meters and went prone behind a rock formation that she had identified on satellite imagery 14 days ago. She settled her rifle. She adjusted her position with the micro corrections of muscle memory. She looked through her scope. The valley spread below her, and it was worse than the drone feed had shown, because drone feeds are two-dimensional and reality is not. And the reality of what was happening in that valley had a texture and an immediacy that the screen in the operations center could not fully translate. She could see vehicles burning. She could see Marines using terrain for cover in ways that told her instantly and viscerally that they were pinned, not tactically positioned pinned, in the way that means you are not making decisions, you are simply surviving. She could see the medical teams in the open, trying to reach the wounded from vehicles that had been destroyed in the first minutes of the ambush. And she could see the rounds impacting around them, and she understood with precise clarity that those medical teams were going to take casualties in the next few minutes if nothing's changed. She looked for her first target. The machine gun nest was where her calculations had put it. She found it in 4 seconds. The crew was exactly as she had predicted they would be, positioned 1 gunner, 1 feeder, 1 spotter behind a natural rock formation that provided cover from the ground. But not Madison Carter had noted 2 weeks ago on a different day when the stakes were 0 from elevation 2,340 meters with a specific angle of approach. She dialed her scope. She checked her wind data. She breathed. And then for the first time in her entire deployment, Sergeant Madison Carter did exactly what she had been trained, tested, and certified to do. The first shot broke at 912 meters. The machine gun went silent. In the valley below, a voice on the radio said, "What just happened? Is that gun silent?" And another voice said, I don't know. Keep moving, keep moving." And Madison was already moving her scope to the second target. Inside the operations center, Major Rourke heard the radio traffic change. He moved to the drone feed monitor. He stared. He reached out very slowly and gripped the edge of the table. Colonel Hargrove came off the phone. "What is it?" Rourke's voice was completely flat in the way that voices go flat when a person is processing something they don't yet have a framework for. "Sir, I think someone just fired on the machine gun nest at grid reference." "Fired? Who authorized fire?" Rourke looked at the drone feed for another second. Then he turned and looked at the corner of the operations center where Madison Carter had been sitting 40 minutes ago. The chair was empty. "Sir," Rourke said, "I think Sergeant Carter is on the ridge." Hargrove stared at him. "She what?" "I think she went up the northern ridgeline spur, sir. The one she identified in the briefing 2 weeks ago that you—" "Get her back. Get her on the radio and order her back right now." Rourke picked up the handset. He called her call sign 3 times. He knew even as he called it that she either didn't have a radio on that frequency she'd left too fast for a full comm setup, or she did have a radio and she was making a professional decision about what she could afford to interrupt right now. He called 3 more times, no response. Hargrove said, "Who authorized this?" Nobody answered, because nobody had. She had authorized it herself. And 2,000 meters away, and 680 meters above them, Sergeant Madison Carter was already acquiring her third target. Her hands were completely steady. This is the part of the story that people who don't understand snipers sometimes find difficult to believe. But it is true, and it is important. Madison Carter's hands were completely steady. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid. She was afraid with the specific high-frequency fear of a person who is doing something irreversible and consequential and alone without the comfort of orders or authorization or anyone else who shares the weight of the decision. She was afraid and her hands were steady because she had trained for this exact condition, not just the shooting but the fear management, the psychological discipline of performing a precise physical task while your nervous system is screaming at you that the stakes are too high for precision. She had trained for it and she had gotten very good at it, and nobody had ever asked her to show them. She fired again. The second RPG team ceased functioning. In the valley below, the geometry of the ambush shifted by a degree that most of the Marines inside it didn't yet understand, but their bodies felt a slight reduction in the density of incoming fire, a slight widening of the space between what was possible and what was certain death. A squad that had been completely pinned for 19 minutes found suddenly and without fully understanding why that there was a window of movement. Their sergeant, a 23-year-old from Georgia, who had never heard of Madison Carter and would not learn her name until years later, looked at the window and said in the simple declarative language of someone making the most important decision of his life, "Move. Right now, move." They moved. They got 300 meters before the fire intensified again. 300 meters they could not have gotten 60 seconds earlier. 300 meters that meant 12 Marines were no longer in the kill zone. Madison was already on the next target. The valley below was changing. Not saved, not even close to saved, but changing. And in the operations center, Major Rourke stood at the drone feed monitor and watched the change with the expression of a man who is watching something he did not expect and cannot fully categorize. He watched the machine gun nests going quiet one by one. He watched the RPG fire becoming less coordinated. He watched the Marines below beginning tentatively to move in ways that hadn't been possible before. He watched all of this, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't require him to either celebrate what was happening or condemn it, and he wasn't ready to do either yet. Colonel Hargrove said, "Someone get me Carter on the radio," and Rourke picked up the handset and called her call sign again. And again there was no response, because Madison Carter was doing the thing she had always been capable of doing, the thing she had demonstrated in training and in testing and in every professional metric the Marine Corps used to evaluate its snipers, the thing that nobody in this battalion had ever trusted her to do in the field. She was shooting, and every shot was mathematics made real, and every shot was buying time for people who were running out of it, and every shot was the answer to the question that had been asked of her silently and dismissively for the entire deployment, the question of whether she was real, whether she was capable, whether she actually belonged here. She was answering it the only way that question ever gets answered definitively. She was answering it with results. And down in the valley, the ambush that had been designed to destroy an entire battalion was beginning in small but measurable ways to come apart. The radio traffic in the operations center changed tone. It was subtle, but Rourke heard it. The voices were still stressed, still urgent, still reporting casualties and contact. But underneath the urgency, something was different. The absolute suffocating certainty of doom that had been in every transmission for the past hour and a half had shifted by a degree that was hard to name, but impossible to miss towards something that wasn't hope yet, but was the precondition of hope. Space. Options. The faint, fragile sense that the situation was not completely fixed. Hargrove heard it too. He stood at the drone feed and watched, and for the first time since the ambush began, his face showed something other than controlled certainty. It showed confusion, because what was happening on that screen did not match the briefings he had received. It did not match the assessment that had led him to freeze and call Corps and order everyone to stand down. It matched instead the assessment that the sergeant in the corner had presented 45 minutes ago. The assessment he had not had time to listen to, the assessment that would have required him to trust someone he had not yet decided deserved to be trusted. He watched, and the valley continued to change. And somewhere on a ridge, 2 kilometers away in the cold mountain air, in complete professional isolation, Sergeant Madison Carter was doing the work. She was not thinking about the operations center. She was not thinking about the colonel. She was not thinking about authorization or protocol or the career consequences of what she was doing. She was thinking about wind. She was thinking about elevation. She was thinking about the next target and the one after that and the one after that. She was thinking in the language she was most fluent in, the precise mathematical language of long-range marksmanship. And she was speaking that language with a clarity and a fluency that her instructors had recognized and her commanding officers had never bothered to see. Down in the valley, Staff Sergeant Delgado heard the machine gun that had been pinning his squad for 2 hours go quiet. He looked at his Marines. He looked at the direction they needed to go. He said, now, right now. They ran, and the fire they expected did not come, and they reached cover they hadn't been able to reach since the ambush started. And Delgado got on the radio and said, with the specific emotion of a man who has just moved from certainty of death to possibility of survival, Charlie 3 is moving. Charlie 3 is mobile. Someone tell me what is happening up on that ridge. And nobody in the operations center answered him, because they didn't have an answer that fit within the authorized version of events. But every Marine in the valley who heard his voice, the change in it from the desperation of 40 minutes ago to the raw, barely contained energy of someone who has just been given back a future, understood that something had changed. Something was happening. And the something was one woman with a rifle who had decided that the mathematics of doing nothing did not add up to acceptable. There would be time later for consequences. There would be time for investigations and after-action reviews and the particular administrative machinery that the military uses to process events that don't fit the established framework. There would be time for Colonel Hargrove to decide what the official records said about this morning. There would be time for all of that. But right now, in this moment in this valley, 480 Marines were still alive, and the ambush that had been designed to kill them was losing its coherence, and one sniper was still working through her pre-calculated target list with the steady, patient precision of a professional doing her job. And the morning that had begun as a carefully prepared trap was beginning slowly and not without cost to become something different. It was beginning to become survivable. The 7th shot changed everything. Not because it was the most difficult shot Madison Carter had taken that morning, not because it silenced the most dangerous position on the ridgeline. It changed everything because of what happened in the 30 seconds after it, when the radio traffic in the valley below shifted in a way that no military doctrine had a name for, but every Marine who was there that day would remember for the rest of their lives. Timestamp 7:42 a.m., approximately 94 minutes into the ambush. Staff Sergeant Delgado's voice came over the battalion net, and there was something in it. Not hope exactly, not relief, not even confidence, but the very first molecular trace of something that had been completely absent from every transmission for the past hour and a half. He said, "Echo element is moving. We are moving. Whatever is happening on that ridge, keep doing it." And then almost to himself, almost off mic, he said, "God bless whoever that is." Nobody responded. Nobody had the clearance to respond. But in the operations center at FOB Falcon Major, Dennis Rourke heard those words and felt something move in his chest that he didn't have a professional vocabulary for. He was looking at this drone feed. He was watching the geometry of the valley rearrange itself in real time. He was watching positions that had been static for 90 minutes suddenly become mobile. He was watching the systematic, precise, methodical elimination of the ambush's key nodes one by one, and the pattern was so clear, so structured, so obviously the product of a trained mind that had pre-planned this exact sequence, that Rourke had a moment of absolute clarity that was also, he would later admit privately, a moment of absolute shame. She had told him. She had told him exactly what she was going to do. She had shown him the map. She had shown him the calculations. She had told him she had range cards for every position. And he had looked at the map and looked at her and made a choice that had nothing to do with whether her assessment was correct. Colonel Hargrove's voice came from directly behind him. "What's the casualty count?" The battalion surgeon's voice relayed through the operations center came back. "Confirmed KYA 11, wounded in action 37, several critical." Hargrove processed the numbers with the controlled expression of a senior officer who has learned to receive casualty reports without showing what they do to him. In the tactical situation, Rourke pointed at the drone feed. "Sir, the ambush is degrading. The northern machine gun complex is completely silent. 2 of the 3 RPG teams have ceased firing. Enemy command and control appears disrupted." Hargrove stared at the screen. He was quiet for a long moment. "How pleased," Rourke said. "Sir, I believe Sergeant Carter reached firing position at elevation 2340 and is engaging the key ambush nodes." Another silence, longer this time. "She left without authorization." "Yes, sir." "Against a direct order." "Yes, sir." Hargrove looked at the screen again. The valley was changing. Right in front of him, in exactly the way the unauthorized sergeant had said it would change if someone disrupted those positions. He said very quietly, "Does she have comms?" "Negative, sir. She's operating without radio contact." Hargrove's jaw tightened. He turned away from the screen, and he said the sentence that Major Rourke would think about for years afterward, the sentence that revealed something about leadership and institution in the gap between them. "When she comes back, I want her in my office immediately." Not "thank God someone moved." Not "get her what she needs." Not "how do we support what she's doing." Just "when she comes back, I want her in my office." Rourke turned back to the screen. He picked up the handset. He called Carter's call sign one more time, not because he expected an answer, but because he needed to do something with his hands while he processed the moral weight of the situation he was standing inside. No response. She was still working, and the valley was still changing. Timestamp 7:51 a.m. On the ridge at elevation 2,340 meters, Madison Carter was 8 targets into a sequence she had planned for 10, and her body was operating in the specific heightened state that elite athletes and combat veterans and surgeons in the middle of complex procedures all describe in different language, but mean the same thing: the state where training becomes automatic and conscious thought shifts from process to evaluation, where you stop thinking about how to do the thing and start thinking only about whether the thing is being done correctly. She was no longer afraid. She had been afraid during the climb. She had been afraid during the first shot. But somewhere between the first target and the third, the fear had been metabolized by the demands of the work, converted into the fuel that it actually was: a heightened awareness, a sharpened focus, an acceleration of every perceptual and cognitive process that made her better at what she was doing rather than worse. She acquired the 9th target, spotter position Eastern Spur, coordinating fire for the last functioning RPG team. She had marked this position 2 weeks ago with a note in her margin: critical node disruption of this position degrades enemy fire coordination by approximately 60%. At the time she wrote that note, she had been sitting alone in a supply room with a map and a flashlight. Now she was living inside the calculation. She fired. The spotter position went silent. And in the valley below, the last RPG team fired one more round wildly without coordination and then stopped. A voice on the battalion net said, "What just happened? Did someone take out their spotter?" Another voice said, "I don't know, but keep moving, keep moving. The fear ed is dropping." And a third voice, Walker's voice, the lieutenant colonel himself in the valley with his Marines, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a commander who has just seen a door open where there was only wall, said, "All elements, this is actual. I am seeing reduced enemy fire across the northern axis. Platoon leaders, give me status. Now." The responses came in rapid succession. Alpha able to move. Bravo able to move with casualties. Charlie 3 elements, Mobile 1 still pinned at the southern tree line. Walker said, "Charlie, what do you need?" The Charlie commander said, "Sir, I have 1 machine gun complex on the southwestern ridgeline that is still active. If that goes down, we can push." Walker said, "Copy." And then Walker did something that Rourke, watching the drone feed, understood immediately. Walker looked up, not at the ridgeline where the remaining machine gun was, at the northern ridgeline spur at the elevation where someone had been working for the past 40 minutes. He looked up at it for 3 seconds. Then he got back on the radio and said, "All elements prepare to move on my command. We are getting out of this valley." He didn't know who was on that ridge. He didn't know it was Madison Carter. He didn't know it was the sergeant his battalion had spent months dismissing and sidelining and looking past. He just knew that someone up there was doing the work that needed to be done, and he was going to trust it. That was its own kind of leadership, and it mattered. Timestamp 8:03 a.m. Madison found the southwestern machine gun complex in her scope. It was the most difficult shot of the morning. The wind at this elevation had shifted in the past 20 minutes. She felt it on the left side of her face before her instruments confirmed it, the subtle change in direction that meant her calculations needed updating. She ran the adjustment in her head. New angle of approach, new wind value, new point of aim. It took her 45 seconds. 45 seconds in which the machine gun below continued to operate, and 3 Marines from Charlie Company, pinned in the southern tree line, continued to be unable to move. She heard them on the radio. She had kept the handset clipped to her shoulder throughout, and she heard everything. A young voice she couldn't tell who saying quietly, "Come on, come on, come on." On into the radio, just out loud, to the universe, to whoever might be listening, she finished her calculation. She settled. She breathed. She fired. The machine gun went silent at 8:04 a.m. Walker's voice came immediately. "All elements move now. Push south, do not stop." And the valley, which had been a killing ground for 1 hour and 57 minutes, started to become something else. The Marines of 2nd Battalion began to move. Timestamp 8:04 a.m. to 8:31 a.m. What happened in the next 27 minutes was not clean. It was not a Hollywood extraction. It was not a smooth, coordinated withdrawal executed exactly as planned. It was loud and costly and terrifying, and it cost lives that had already been spent and threatened more that hadn't been. But it was movement. It was forward movement, or rather outward movement away from the kill zone and toward the edges of the trap that had been built for them. And movement in the mathematics of survival is everything. Walker moved with his Marines. He did not command from the rear. He was in the column, radio in hand, voice steady, making decisions with the information he had, which was incomplete, and with the resources he had, which were reduced by 11 dead and 37 wounded, and the accumulated exhaustion of 2 hours of ambush. But he moved, and his Marines moved with him. Madison covered them. That's the simplest way to say it. She covered them. She was still on the ridge, and she was running low on ammunition. She had carried what she could carry on a solo climb, which was not unlimited, and she was making decisions about priority targets with the economy of a professional who knows exactly what she has left and exactly what each round needs to accomplish. An enemy element moving to re-engage the southern column. She engaged it. A position on the western ridgeline, repositioning to cover the evacuation route. She engaged it. A runner, an enemy communications runner, she assessed moving between 2 positions to restore the coordination she had been methodically destroying for the past hour. She engaged him. Every round she fired was a decision. Every decision had a calculus. She was not shooting at random. She was maintaining a mobile protective umbrella over a battalion that was moving through terrain that was still dangerous, and she was doing it alone with a finite resource, making real-time priority assessments that would have been challenging for a fully equipped and fully staffed sniper team, let alone a single Marine on a ridge with a notebook and a will that had not yet encountered its limit. In the operations center, Rourke was on the radio with the medevac helicopters. "We are opening a corridor," he said. "Grid reference follows." He gave the grid. The helicopter pilot came back, "Copy. What's my threat assessment on approach?" Rourke looked at the drone feed. He watched a position on the western ridgeline go quiet. He said, "Threat is being suppressed. I cannot guarantee the corridor, but it is the best window we have had in 2 hours." The pilot was quiet for a moment. Then, "We're coming in. Tell your people to mark the LZ." That was its own content times voltage. The helicopter crew didn't know who was suppressing those positions. They just knew someone was, and they were going to trust it. Same as Walker. Same answer. Hargrove heard the exchange. He was standing at the back of the operations center, and he had not spoken in several minutes. He was watching the drone feed with an expression that Rourke could not read because Hargrove had too much practice with his own face to let it tell the truth unsupervised. but his hands clasped behind his back were clasped tighter than usual, and he did not order the helicopters to stand down. He did not countermand Rourke's coordination. He stood there, and he watched, and he said nothing. Timestamp 8:19 a.m. Madison was on her last magazine. She had 18 rounds left. She knew the number precisely because she always knew the number precisely because that was the kind of discipline she had maintained every day of a deployment that had given her almost no opportunity to use it. 18 rounds. She looked at the valley below. She assessed the remaining threat picture. She made a list in her head, not on paper, a priority list of what those 18 rounds needed to accomplish to give the battalion the best chance of getting out. Her hands were still steady. Her water was gone. She hadn't eaten since the night before. The cold at this elevation had moved through her clothing an hour ago and settled into her joints with the specific patient discomfort of someone who has been still in the wind for a long time. None of that entered the calculation. She had been cold before. She had been hungry before. She had been uncomfortable in every training environment the Marine Corps and its instructors had been able to construct, and she had learned through repetition and through will to regard physical discomfort as information rather than instruction. It told her the condition she was operating in. It did not tell her to stop. She tracked the medevac helicopter on the approach. She watched it from above from her elevation, and she watched the route it was flying, and she watched the ground beneath and around its approach path for threats. She found one, a repositioning element on the eastern slope, two fighters moving to a position that would give them an angle on the LZ. She was at the edge of her comfortable range for this shot. The wind, the angle, the declining ammunition all pressed against each other in the calculation. She ran the math. She adjusted. She fired once. The movement on the eastern slope stopped. The helicopter made it to the LZ, Walker's voice over the radio, with something in it that he would have denied under any circumstances, but that everyone in the operations center heard, "First bird is down. First bird is down on the LZ. Medical personnel, move your casualties now." Rourke closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and got back on the radio because there was still a long way to go. Timestamp 8:31 a.m. Inside the valley, the Marines of 2nd Battalion were moving with the specific energy of people who have been given back the possibility of survival and are using every fraction of it before it can be taken away again. The wounded were being moved to the LZ. Units were consolidating. Walker was accounting for every element, every squad, every individual with the systematic thoroughness of a commander who was not going to leave this valley without being able to say he knew where every one of his Marines was. Charlie Company's pinned element, the 3 squads that had been cut off in the southern tree line, reached the main body at 0828. Their sergeant, a veteran named Ortiz, who had done 2 previous deployments in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and had never in those 4 deployments felt as close to the end as he had felt in that tree line, came in at a run, his Marines behind him, and grabbed the first officer he saw by the arm and said, "Who is on that ridge? Who has been shooting? Because whoever that is, I need you to understand that person just saved my entire element." The officer said, "We don't know exactly, Sergeant." Ortiz stared at him. "You don't know. We know who we believe it is, but then somebody needs to find them and make sure they're okay, right now." The words started moving through the battalion the way words move in combat, faster than official communication carried by the immediate human need to understand what just happened and why. Someone on the ridge, someone with a sniper rifle, someone who had been working the problem for over an hour alone without support. The word moved, and with the word came questions. Who would go up there alone? Who had the skill for those shots and at those distances in those conditions? Who had the knowledge of this valley to know exactly which positions to target? Some of the Marines began to form an answer, not because they knew they didn't know, but because they had spent months with this battalion, and there was only one person in 2nd Battalion that the pieces assembled into. A Marine from Bravo Company, a corporal named Jenkins, who had been among the most vocal in his private skepticism about the female sniper in their midst, stood at the edge of the LZ watching the helicopters and said to no one in particular, "It's Carter, isn't it? It's Sergeant Carter." And the Marine next to him, who didn't answer, immediately finally said, "Yeah, I think so." Jenkins was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She's been up there this whole time." Not a question, a statement of a fact he was still computing the weight of. In the operations center, the mood had shifted in the way that moods shift when the outcome is not yet certain, but the trajectory has changed. Rourke was coordinating the extraction with the precision of a man who has been given a second chance and is not going to waste it. The second helicopter was inbound. The casualty count had stopped, climbing. The remaining wounded were being stabilized, and the threat picture, while not zero, had degraded to the point where movement was possible. The trap had not been escaped. Not yet. But its jaws had been forced open one shot at a time by a Marine who was still on a ridge. With Rourke checked the time and did the math and made an estimate, probably very few rounds remaining. He picked up the handset. He tried her call sign again, this time because he meant it differently than the times before. Not because Hargrove told him to, because he wanted her to know that someone in the operations center was tracking her, was thinking about her, was aware that she was up there alone and running low. Sierra 2-1, this is Falcon Operations. Do you copy static? Sierra 2-1, if you receive break twice. 2 clicks came through the static. Clean, deliberate, she heard him. Rourke felt something release in his chest. He said, "Oi, Sierra 2-1, second bird is inbound 3 minutes. LZ is active. We have you on the drone. You are covered." 2 more clicks. He understood what they meant. She understood the situation. She was still working. Hargrove moved forward to stand next to Rourke. He was looking at the drone feed. He could see the ridge. He could see at the edge of the drone's resolution the position she was holding. He could not see her face. He looked at the feed for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "How long has she been up there?" Rourke checked his watch. 1 hour and 23 minutes, sir. Hargrove processed that. "Any alone, Bursary?" "Yes, sir." Another long silence. "What's her ammunition status?" "Unknown, sir. She left without a full load. My estimate is she's near the end." Hargrove looked at the screen. He looked at the Marines moving in the valley below her, the Marines who were alive and moving because of the work she was doing alone on that ridge. He said, "Get her support." Rourke looked at him. "Sir, I said get her support, get someone up that ridge, or get me an asset that can cover her position. She has been carrying this alone long enough." Rourke turned to the radio immediately, not because the order surprised him, because it didn't surprise him, because it was the right call, and somewhere underneath the institutional weight of rank and protocol, Hargrove had always known what the right call was. It had just taken him a long time and a significant cost to make it. Timestamp 8:44 a.m. Madison fired her 16th round. She had 2 left. She was not going to waste them. She looked at the valley below her through the scope, and she did a methodical professional threat assessment of what remained, of what still moved, of what still constituted a danger to the Marines extracting through the corridor below. She identified one remaining priority target, a single position partially concealed that had been repositioning for the past 10 minutes in a direction that would put it on the flank of the evacuation column within the next 4 to 5 minutes. She had been tracking it. She had been waiting for it to settle into its final position before engaging it because she had 2 rounds and she did not miss, and she was not going to start now. She waited. The position settled. She adjusted for the current wind. She fired. The position ceased to be a threat. She had 1 round remaining. She kept it. She looked at the valley and she did the math one more time, and she concluded with the honest, unsentimental precision of a professional that the 1 remaining round was better kept in reserve than spent on a lower priority target. She saved her rifle. She remained in position. She watched. Below her, the 2nd helicopter was lifting off. It carried wounded Marines from 2nd Battalion. It carried men and women who were alive because of decisions that had been made on this ridge over the past hour and a half. Madison watched it rise. She watched it clear the valley walls. She watched it move away into the sky to the east, toward the FOB, toward the medical teams that were waiting, toward the continuation of lives that had been very close, very recently, to ending. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. Those were feelings for later, and later was a concept that had not fully returned to her yet. Right now, she felt what she always felt after a long shooting sequence, empty and alert simultaneously, the particular state of a mind that has been running at maximum capacity and is now idling without having fully returned to rest. She thought about the Marines in the valley. She thought about Staff Sergeant Delgado's voice on the radio. She thought about a corporal she didn't know saying, keep moving, keep moving." She thought about all the range cards she had ever written that nobody ever asked to see them. And then she heard something on her handset that she had not heard in the past hour and a half. A voice she didn't expect coming through the static with the particular measured weight of a man who is choosing his words with more care than he usually does. Walker's voice, the lieutenant colonel himself on the battalion net. He said, "All elements, all surviving elements of 2nd Battalion. I have just received confirmation from Falcon Operations that our extraction corridor was created and maintained by a single Marine operating independently from elevation 2,340 meters for approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes. That Marine is still on the ridge." He paused, not a dramatic pause. The pause of a man making sure the next sentence comes out right. "I don't know who gave the order. I know what the result was. And I know that when we get back to the FOB, there are conversations that need to happen at every level of this command. But right now, for the Marines listening to this, we are getting out because someone refused to let us die." Another pause. Then, all elements continue extraction. Let's bring everybody home. The radio was quiet for 3 seconds after he finished. Then the acknowledgement calls started coming in one after another, Alpha and Bravo, and Charlie, and the medical teams, and the support elements, and the helicopter crews, all of them checking in, all of them moving, all of them still alive on a morning when they had been designed to be otherwise. On the ridge, Madison Carter listened to all of it. She didn't move. She stayed in position, watching, because watching was still useful even with one round, because her eyes and her assessment were still assets, even without ammunition, because she was a professional, and professionals do not stand up and walk away until the job is done. The job was not done yet. But for the first time since she had started climbing, she allowed herself to believe that it was going to be. And that was enough, for now. The last helicopter had lifted off 4 minutes ago, and the valley below was quieter than it had been at any point in the past 2 hours. Not silent, never fully silent, because the residue of a battle doesn't go quiet all at once. There were still isolated shots from enemy fighters who hadn't gotten the message that the ambush had collapsed, still voices on the radio, accounting for personnel, still the distant mechanical percussion of rotors moving east. But the quality of the sound had changed. The killing frequency was gone. What remained was the aftermath frequency, which is its own kind of painful but is survivable in a way the other is not. Madison Carter was still on the ridge. She had been in the prone position for 1 hour and 37 minutes, and her body was communicating this fact to her with the frank, unsentimental honesty of a body that has been asked to do something difficult for a long time and is now presenting the invoice. Her left hip had gone past discomfort into a deep grinding ache from the rock beneath her. Her fingers, which had been cold for the past hour, had moved into the territory of cold that requires deliberate thought to operate correctly, the kind where you have to consciously tell your hand to close and then verify that it has closed. Her water had been gone since before the 7th shot. She was running on the specific fuel source that has no nutritional label, the one that comes from somewhere below the physical and above the rational, the one that people try to explain afterward and never quite manage to. She kept watching the valley. 1 round remaining. She wasn't going to use it unless she had to, but she was going to keep watching until she was certain she didn't have to, because certain was the standard she had always held herself to, and this was not the morning to lower it. The radio crackled. Rourke's voice. "Sierra 2-1 Falcon Operations. We have visual on your position. The valley is clear. I say again, the valley is clear. You are authorized to descend. Do you copy?" 2 clicks, she copied. She did not immediately move. She scanned one more time, slow and methodical, left to right, near to far, the way she had been taught, in the way she had practiced 10,000 times in conditions that mattered less than this one. She found nothing that required her last round. She safed her weapon. She began the process of getting up, which was more complicated than it sounds after 1 hour and 37 minutes of prone, and which required a specific internal negotiation with joints and muscles that had formed strong opinions about their current situation. She stood. She looked at the valley one final time. Below, the last elements of 2nd Battalion were moving through the southern corridor. She could see them from up here, small against the terrain, moving with the purposeful exhaustion of people who are not yet safe, but are moving towards safe, which is its own kind of grace. She watched them for a moment. She didn't know their names from up here. She didn't need to. She started down. Timestamp 9:02 a.m. The descent was harder than the climb had been, which is always true and always a surprise anyway, because the body going up is running on adrenaline and purpose, and the body coming down is running on the honest ledger of what it spent to get there. Madison took it carefully, not slowly carefully. There is a difference, and she knew the difference, and the distinction mattered because a twisted ankle on this ridgeline alone was a problem with a different set of consequences than a twisted ankle anywhere else she had ever been. She moved from rock to rock with the deliberate attention of someone who is not going to add her own name to the casualty list at this stage of the morning. Her mind, freed from the locked concentration of the firing position, started doing what minds do when they are given space after intense focus. It started processing. Not the tactical picture, that part was clean, the math was done, the outcomes were what they were. It started processing the other part, the part that had nothing to do with wind or elevation or trigger pressure. The part about what she had done and what it meant and what was coming. She had disobeyed a direct order. She had left the FOB without authorization. She had conducted an independent combat operation without command approval. These were not ambiguous facts. They were as clean and clear as any of her firing solutions, and they led to consequences that were equally clean and clear. There would be an investigation. There might be disciplinary action. There might be charges. Hargrove had said he wanted her in his office. She did not carry any illusions about what that conversation was going to contain. And walking down a ridgeline in southern Afghanistan with one round left in her rifle, she found to her own mild surprise that she was completely at peace with that. Not because she didn't care about her career, she did. She had spent years building it, protecting it, maintaining it at a higher standard than anyone around her, because she understood that the margin for error available to her was thinner than the margin available to anyone else in the same position. She cared about her career deeply and specifically in the way you care about something you've paid for with parts of yourself you can't get back. But she had done the math on this too. She had done it on the way to the gate that morning, and the math had been simple. The cost of action versus the cost of inaction, calculated not in career terms, but in the only currency that matters when 480 Marines are inside a kill zone. She had made the calculation. She had accepted the result. She was not going to revise it now just because the shooting was over and the consequences were approaching. She kept descending. Timestamp 9:18 a.m. She was 2/3 of the way down when she heard footsteps above her. Fast footsteps moving with more urgency than caution, which told her they belonged to someone younger than the situation warranted and angrier than the terrain permitted. She stopped. She turned. A Marine was coming down the ridgeline behind her, not from the top, from a lateral approach, which meant he had come up from the valley floor, rather than from the FOB, which meant he was one of Walker's Marines. He was a staff sergeant. She read his rank automatically even before she read his face. And then she read his face, and she recognized him. Delgado, the voice from the radio. Charlie 3, the element that had been cut off in the southern tree line, the voice that had said, "Somebody come," and then an hour later, "Keep moving, keep moving." He stopped 10 feet from her. He was breathing hard from the climb. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was younger than she had pictured from his voice, maybe 26, with a specific combination of exhaustion and intensity that comes from spending 2 hours in a situation where you genuinely did not expect to survive. He said, "You're Carter." Not a question. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "My whole element." He stopped. He tried again. "I had 22 Marines in that tree line. When that last gun went quiet, we had 30 seconds before they were going to reposition, and we would have been..." He stopped again. Madison waited. She knew what came after "we would have been," and she didn't need him to finish it. He seemed to know she knew. He said, "I just needed to see who you were." She said, "You okay? Your Marines okay?" He said, 11 of them are going home in the wrong direction. The other 11 are going home." She said, "I'm sorry about the 11. He nodded. They stood on the ridgeline in the cold wind, 2 Marines who had never spoken before this moment, between whom a very particular kind of debt had just been established, the kind that doesn't have a vocabulary in any official document. Then Delgado said very quietly, "Thank you." And Madison said, "Do me a favor. Anything. When you get back and the investigations start, and they will start, you tell them what you saw from the valley. The accurate version. Not the version that's convenient for anyone. The accurate version. Delgado held her gaze. Every word. She nodded. She turned back toward the FOB. After a moment, he fell into step behind her. Timestamp 9:31 a.m. They reached the FOB gate together at 9:31 a.m. The same Lance Corporal who had waved Madison through 4 hours ago was still on the gate. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been told something happened and is now standing in the presence of the person it happened to and has no idea what the appropriate response is. He said, "Sergeant Carter." She said, "Corporal." She signed back in. The entry log would later become one of the key documents in the official investigation, the timestamp showing when she left, the timestamp showing when she returned the weapon she carried, and the notation made in the corporal's careful handwriting of the one remaining round in her magazine that she signed back in with her rifle. 1 round, 19 targets, 18 rounds expended, 1 remaining. That ratio would also appear in the investigation documents, and the investigators who reviewed it would consult with sniper instructors from Quantico. And those instructors would use words like extraordinary and unprecedented, and in one case, with the particular bluntness of a man who has spent 30 years evaluating marksmanship, simply perfect. But that was later. Right now, Madison Carter walked through the gate of FOB Falcon and into the morning that was on the other side of everything that had happened, and she felt the specific physical reality of having been cold and hungry and alone and afraid and precise and effective all at once for the better part of 2 hours, and she felt her legs finally fully communicate their opinion of the climb. She kept walking, timestamp 9:39 a.m. The operations center was quieter than it had been at any point since the ambush began. The drone feed was still up. The radio was still active. But the emergency frequency of the past 2 hours had given way to the controlled, methodical frequency of damage assessment and recovery, the operational mode that follows crisis and precedes understanding. Rourke was at the communications station. 3 other officers were at the map table. And Colonel Hargrove was standing alone at the window, his back to the room, looking at something outside that none of the other people in the room could see. He heard the door open. He turned. Madison Carter walked in. She still had her rifle. She was still wearing everything she had left with 4 hours ago, and the condition of it told a clear story about where she had been and what she had done. Her face was flat and professional and gave nothing away that she hadn't decided to give. She stood in the doorway for exactly 1 second. Then she came to attention. "Sergeant Carter reporting as ordered, sir." Hargrove looked at her. The room was very quiet. Every officer at the map table had stopped what they were doing. Rourke had his back to the room, but his head was slightly turned in the way that people turn when they are listening to something they are pretending not to hear. Hargrove said, "At ease." She went to parade rest. He walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away. He was taller than her by several inches, a decorated combat veteran with 30 years of command experience, a man who had built his career on the certainty of institutional authority. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "You disobeyed my direct order." She said, "Yes, sir." "You left this installation without authorization." "Yes, sir." "You conducted an independent combat operation outside the chain of command." "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "You're aware of the regulations governing those actions." "Yes, sir." "And you did it anyway." "Yes, sir." He looked at her. She looked at him. Then he said, "Why?" It was not a question with a question mark. It was a question with a weight. She said, "Because the math didn't work, sir. The cost of following the order was higher than the cost of disobeying it. I made the calculation and I accepted the result." Hargrove said, "That's not how the chain of command works." She said, "Sir, it isn't." He said, "You understand I have to investigate this." "Yes, sir." "You understand there may be charges." "Yes, sir." "And you're standing there telling me you'd do it again." She said, "I'm telling you the calculation would be the same, sir. The variables haven't changed." Hargrove was silent for a long time. The room around them had stopped pretending not to listen. Every person in the operations center was hearing this conversation, and every person in it understood that what was happening right now was not just a confrontation between a colonel and a sergeant. It was a confrontation between 2 versions of what the Marine Corps was supposed to be. Then something happened that nobody in that room expected. Hargrove said, "Casualties are 11 killed in action, 39 wounded, 430 surviving Marines extracted from the valley. He paused. Battalion surgeon's assessment is that without disruption of the ambush at the time, and in the manner in which it was disrupted, the casualty count would have reached somewhere between 60 and 70% of battalion strength. He looked at her. 180 to 200 Marines. Another pause. Dead. The word landed in the room with the weight of the number it represented. Madison said nothing. She already knew the math. He said, "You ran those numbers before you left." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "And you made the call." She said, "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've been in this Corps for 30 years, he said. "I've made calls I was right about and calls I was wrong about. 30 years teaches you to tell the difference eventually." He didn't say anything else for a moment. Then he said, "This morning I was wrong about the situation, about the options, about—" He stopped. He appeared to be choosing his next word with more care than he normally gave to word selection. He said, "About you." The room heard it. Every person in it heard it. And Rourke, still at his station, reached up and adjusted something on the radio console that did not need adjusting because he needed to do something with his hands. Madison said, "I understand, sir." Hargrove said, "No, Sergeant, I don't think you do. I'm not being diplomatic. I'm telling you that what you did this morning was professionally and technically beyond what I believed you capable of. That belief was wrong. The fact that it was wrong is on me, not on you. And the investigation that's coming is going to have to contend with both of those facts simultaneously." She looked at him. "Sir, the investigation should go wherever it goes. I'm not asking for a particular outcome." He said, "I know you're not. That's one of the things that makes this conversation harder than you probably think it is." He stepped back. He straightened. He said formally, with the deliberateness of a man making a statement he intends to be remembered, "The investigation will be thorough. It will be fair, and it will accurately reflect the events of this morning in their entirety. Every detail, not a version of the story that protects anyone in this room, including me." Rourke turned from his station. He said nothing, but he turned, and the turning was a statement. Timestamp 10:04 a.m. Word traveled the way word always travels in a battalion, faster than orders, more accurate than rumors, shaped by the specific emotional energy of people who were there, and people who wish they had been, and people who are trying to figure out how to feel about both. By 10 a.m., every Marine on FOB Falcon, who was not in the medical bay, knew the broad outline of what had happened. By 10:30, most of them knew it was Carter. By 11, the details were circulating: the ridgeline, the elevation, the targets, the number of rounds, the unauthorized departure, the one round she came back with. The reactions were not uniform. They were not even mostly what you might expect from a battalion whose members had spent months viewing this particular Marine with skepticism ranging from mild to contemptuous. Some of those Marines processed the information and updated their position immediately with the honest directness of people who are capable of being wrong and knowing it. Others processed it more slowly with the reluctance of people whose skepticism had been so thoroughly refuted that accepting the refutation required also accepting what the skepticism had cost. And some, a smaller number but not zero, responded with a particular kind of defensiveness that looks like continued doubt but is actually something more complicated. The defensive posture of people who are not ready yet to fully confront the thing they were part of. Corporal Jenkins, who had said, "It's Carter, isn't it?" standing at the LZ watching the helicopters, had spent the hour since his return sitting on his bunk without removing his gear. His bunkmate, a lance corporal named Torres, came in and found him there and said, "You heard what happened." Jenkins said, "I was there." Torres said, "Not on the ridge." Jenkins said, "No." Torres said, "You know what I keep thinking about? I keep thinking about that meeting 2 weeks ago. The briefing where she talked about that valley, the position she identified. Remember," Jenkins said, "I wasn't at that briefing." Torres said, "I was." She laid it out. Exactly. Every position that mattered today, she identified 2 weeks ago. And Captain Morrison he made a gesture with his hand, dismissed. Jenkins was quiet. Then he said, "How good is she?" Torres said, 19 targets, 18 rounds, 1 remaining. That's what the armorer logged. Jenkins absorbed this. His bunkmate watched him absorb it. Torres said, "You know what a sniper instructor at Quantico is going to say when they see those numbers?" Jenkins said, "Yeah." Torres said, "Yeah." Another silence. Jenkins finally pulled off his vest. He set it down with the weight of something that was not just the vest. He said, "I have to write a letter to the 3 guys from my squad that didn't make it." He stopped. "I'm going to have to sit with the fact that those letters might have been 4 or 6 or 8 letters instead of 3 if it wasn't for." He didn't finish. Torres didn't make him. In the medical bay, Staff Sergeant Delgado sat next to a bed where one of his Marines, a young corporal from Texas named Reyes, was being treated for a shrapnel wound to the left shoulder that had taken him out of the fight in the first 20 minutes. Reyes was awake and alert, and the anger of the ambushed was still bright in his eyes. He said, "Who pulled us out?" Sergeant Delgado said, "Extraction was coordinated by the battalion." Reyes said, "That's not what I mean. Who was on the ridge? Who was shooting those positions?" Delgado said, "Carter, Sergeant Madison Carter." Reyes frowned. "The female sniper, the one who does the paperwork." Delgado looked at him steadily. "She's the one who kept your element alive long enough to get extracted. Her and nobody else." Reyes was quiet. He looked at the ceiling. He said, "I said some things about her last month into the common room." Delgado said, "I know, I heard you." Reyes said, "That's different now." Delgado said, "It is. What are you going to do about it?" Reyes thought about it. "Talk to her." Delgado said, "Good start." Timestamp 11:15 a.m. Lieutenant Colonel Walker arrived at the FOB at 11:08 a.m. He was the last element out of the valley because he had personally accounted for every Marine before he left, a process that had taken until 10:51 a.m. and had required him to stand in that valley for over 2 hours after the shooting stopped, making sure that no one who could come home was left behind. He came through the gate with the specific bearing of a man who has been through something that has rearranged his understanding of several important things and is still in the process of that rearrangement. He went directly to the medical bay. He spent 20 minutes moving through the beds, talking to the wounded. He didn't give speeches. He talked. He asked questions. He listened. He told 2 Marines he was putting them in for commendations. He sat with a corporal who was not yet stable and said nothing, just sat, because sometimes sitting is the only thing that fits. Then he came out of the medical bay and he went to find Madison Carter. She was in the armorer's station cleaning her rifle, because of course she was. That was what she did when a mission ended. Regardless of everything else, regardless of the investigation pending and the conversation with Hargrove, and the weight of the morning still fresh on her body and her mind, she cleaned her rifle. Because that was the discipline. That was the standard. And she held the standard at all times, especially now. Walker came in. She started to rise. He said, "At ease." She settled back. He sat down across the cleaning table from her, which was not a thing colonels typically do in armorers' stations, but Walker had stopped doing only typical things approximately 3 hours ago. He said, "I heard your exchange with the colonel." She said, "Sir, he said he got it right. That took something." She said, "It was accurate, sir." He said, "Accurate is easy. Saying it in front of your staff when it changes the story you've been telling, that's the harder part." He looked at her hands, still working the cleaning rod with the automatic precision of long practice. He said, "2 weeks ago, the Valley briefing." She looked up. He said, "You flagged those positions." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I was in that briefing." She said nothing. He said, "I let it go past." She said, "Yes, sir, what?" He said, "That's on me." She said, "It's in her pants, sir." He said, "No, Sergeant, it's in the record. The investigation is going to establish a timeline. That briefing is going to be in that timeline. And what it shows is that the information necessary to anticipate this ambush was presented by a member of this battalion 2 weeks before the ambush occurred and was not acted upon. That's the record." He leaned forward slightly. "I want you to know that when the investigators ask me about that briefing, I'm going to tell them exactly what happened, who presented what was presented, and what the response was, including my response or lack of response." Madison set down the cleaning rod. She looked at him. Something moved in her face that she did not fully suppress. It was not gratitude exactly. She had not yet fully processed the morning well enough for gratitude. It was something closer to recognition. The recognition of being seen fully and honestly by someone with the rank to have chosen not to. She said, "Thank you, sir." He said, "Don't thank me for doing the right thing. That's too low a bar." They sat in the armorer's station for another minute, Not talking, the only sound, the slide of the cleaning rod, and the particular quiet of two people who have just come through the same event from very different angles and are finding in the aftermath that they are actually in the same place. Timestamp 12:30 p.m. The formal investigation was opened at noon. It would run for 6 weeks. It would involve investigators from battalion level, brigade level, and the Marine Corps Inspector General's office. It would include sworn testimony from 47 individuals, analysis of the drone footage review of all radio transmissions, and a forensic accounting of every round fired from elevation 2,340 meters that morning. It would be one of the most thorough after-action investigations in the history of the 2nd Marine Battalion in that theater. And it would find, with the clarity that thorough investigations find when they are actually thorough, several things that were going to be uncomfortable for several people. It would find that the tactical intelligence assessed by Sergeant Madison Carter 2 weeks before the ambush had accurately identified the key positions used in that ambush. It would find that this assessment had been presented in a briefing and not actioned. It would find that on the morning of the ambush, Carter had presented her assessment of the ambush architecture to the senior officer present in the operations center and been dismissed. It would find that her subsequent unauthorized action had disrupted the ambush in the specific manner she had predicted, and that the disruption had been the determinative factor in the survival of the battalion's remaining personnel. And it would find, documented in careful, bureaucratic, unambiguous language, that the chain of events that led to 11 Marines dying in that valley had been influenced, not caused. The lawyers were careful about that word, but influenced by institutional decisions about who was trusted to provide what kind of input. Hargrove's career would survive the investigation. He was not court-martialed. He was not demoted. He was counseled and reassigned, which in the Marine Corps is a consequence with a specific meaning and a specific cost. And he paid it with the composure of a man who had decided to pay it honestly. He never publicly disputed the investigation's findings. He never publicly blamed anyone else. That was those who knew him said the best thing about him. Walker was commended. His command of the extraction under fire, his accountability for all personnel, and his tactical adaptation to the changing situation were all cited positively. The commendation noted in language that was clear to anyone who read it carefully that his trust in the effect being produced from the ridge, his willingness to move when other commanders might have waited for authorization, had been a critical decision. And Madison Carter. The investigation's findings regarding Carter were by the end almost beside the point for the people who had been in that valley. The legal and administrative question of whether she should be punished for disobeying an order was real and was processed through real mechanisms and produced real outcomes. But that question, however legitimately important, existed in a different register from the question that every Marine who had been in that valley carried inside them, the question that didn't have a legal answer because it wasn't a legal question, the question of who she was, the question of what she was capable of, the question that the Marine Corps had asked itself about her in a particular way, with a particular skepticism for the entire deployment, and to which the ridge at elevation 2,340 meters had provided an answer so definitive that it had permanently altered the terms of the discussion. She had been seen as a problem to manage. The battlefield had revealed what she actually was. In the medical bay, recovering from minor cold injuries to her hands and the accumulated physical cost of the morning, Madison Carter lay in a bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the range cards still in her notebook. The ones for the other valleys within 50 kilometers of the FOB, the ones nobody had ever asked to see, the ones she had written in supply rooms and in the evenings and in every quiet moment that a deployment provides if you choose to use it that way. She thought about those cards. She thought about the fact that they were still accurate. She thought about the fact that there would be other missions, other valleys, other mornings. She thought about the fact that she was still here to think about it. And she thought about a young Marine named Reyes in the bed 3 rows over who had told Delgado he was going to talk to her, which was a small thing and also not a small thing at all. She closed her eyes, her hands wrapped in the medical bay's inadequate warmth still ached with the cold of the ridge. She didn't mind. She had earned that cold. She had earned every degree of it. Timestamp day 3, FOB Falcon, 7 a.m. The investigation had been open for 48 hours and already the FOB felt different, not visibly different. The routines continued. Morning formations happened. Meals were served. Equipment was maintained. The mechanical rhythm of a forward operating base does not pause for moral reckoning, and nobody was asking it to. But underneath the routine in the conversations between formations, and in the silences inside conversations, and in the way certain people looked at certain other people and then looked away, the FOB was working through something that would take longer than 48 hours to fully process. Two investigators from the Brigade Inspector General's office had arrived the previous afternoon. They were both majors, both experienced, both possessed of the particular demeanor that investigation duty produces in people who are good at it, professional neutrality with a current of real attentiveness underneath the look of people who are genuinely trying to find the true rather than construct a predetermined version of it. They had set up in a conference room near the operations center and begun working through the witness list with systematic efficiency. Madison Carter was scheduled for her formal interview at 9 a.m. on day 3. She had been told this at 1800 the previous evening by a corporal who delivered the notification with the self-conscious stiffness of someone who is aware they are delivering a document with weight. She had said, "Thank you," we had signed the acknowledgement form, and she had gone back to what she was doing, which was updating her range cards. Because the mission schedule had not been suspended during the investigation, and she was still a sniper in an active theater, and the range cards for the remaining valleys within her operational range were still not finished. Staff Sergeant Delgado found her in the common room at 08:15, 45 minutes before the interview. He sat across from her without asking if he could sit, which is the prerogative of someone who has earned the right to skip that particular formality. He said, "You eat this morning?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Sleep." She said, "Enough." He looked at her range cards spread across the table. He said, "You know those are going to be in the investigation record. They were going to see that you had pre-calculated data on that valley 2 weeks before the ambush." She said, "I know." He said, "That's going to help you." She said, "It's going to be accurate. Whether it helps me is a different question." He looked at her. "Carter, you saved my entire element, 22 Marines. I want to make sure that the people deciding your fate understand exactly what they are deciding." She set down her pen. She looked at him directly. "Delgado, I want you to go in there and tell them the truth, the complete truth, including the parts where I violated protocol, including the parts where you can't officially justify what I did. The accurate version, not the version that's constructed to protect me." He said, "The accurate version does protect you." She said, "Then it'll do that on its own merits." He studied her for a moment. Then he said, "You know what's strange? I've served with Marines who did brave things. Good Marines, solid Marines. But the ones who did the bravest things usually wanted someone to know about it afterward. They needed it acknowledged in a certain way." He paused. "You don't seem to need that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I needed the Marines in that valley to survive. That needed to happen. What happens to me afterward, I made peace with that on the climb up." He nodded. He stood. He put his hand briefly on the table next to her range cards, not on her arm, not on her shoulder, just on the table, which was a gesture of a specific and honest kind. He said, "I'll see you on the other side of it." She said, "Tell them everything." He walked out. Timestamp 9 a.m. investigation interview room. The two investigators, Major Patricia Chen and Major Robert Aldridge, sat across the table from Madison Carter. Chen led the interview. She was efficient and thorough, and the questions she asked were the kind of questions that reveal a thorough prior review of available documentation. She had clearly watched the drone footage, read the radio transcripts, reviewed the armorer's log, and studied the range cards that had been collected as evidentiary material. She didn't ask questions she already knew the answers to. She asked questions whose answers would fill in what the documentation couldn't tell her. She said, "Sergeant Carter, walk me through your decision-making process from the moment you presented your assessment to Major Rourke to the moment you signed out your weapon." Madison said, "I presented my assessment at approximately 07:15. Major Rourke attempted to get Colonel Hargrove's attention. The colonel was on the phone with Corps and indicated he was not available. After 2 attempts, Rourke returned to me and did not give me authorization. I read his expression and his body language as communicating that he could not authorize the action and that his inability to do so was a function of the command environment, not his own assessment of the tactical situation." Chen said, "You're saying you believed Major Rourke thought the action was tactically sound." "I'm saying I believed he didn't disagree with my analysis. I'm not testifying to what was in his mind." Chen made a note. "And from that point, I made a calculation. The battalion was sustaining casualties at a rate that, if continued, would produce catastrophic losses within 1 to 2 hours. I had pre-calculated firing solutions for the key ambush positions. I had the physical capability to reach a firing position with the necessary time remaining to make a difference. The cost of inaction exceeded the cost of unauthorized action." Aldred said, "Did you consider that your assessment might be wrong?" She said, "Yes. And for Sam, my confidence in the assessment was high. Not certain, nothing is certain. But the pre-calculation matched the observed ambush architecture almost exactly. I was operating on 2 weeks of data on that specific valley. I assigned the probability of my assessment being substantially wrong at less than 10%. Chen said, "And if it had been wrong, if you'd climbed that ridge and your firing positions were off, or the wind data was incorrect?" Madison looked at her steadily. "Then I would have been wrong, and I would have faced the consequences of that wrong decision, along with the wrong decision to disobey orders. That was part of the calculation." Chen looked at her for a moment, then she made another note. "Sergeant Carter, is there anything about your time in 2nd Battalion prior to the ambush that you believe is relevant to the full understanding of the events on the morning in question?" Madison said yes. Chen said, "Please describe it." And Madison Carter spoke for 47 minutes without stopping. She spoke with the same precision she applied to everything, not with anger, not with the heat of grievance, but with the clean, sequential accuracy of a person reporting events they witnessed firsthand. She described the deployment, the support assignments, the briefings where her input was passed over, the reconnaissance requests that Rourke had denied, the Valley briefing 2 weeks before the ambush, the specific language of dismissal she had experienced direct and indirect, the months of range cards and notebooks produced in the absence of authorization to do anything with the information in the field. She did not editorialize. She did not assign motive to the people she described. She described actions and words and outcomes, and she let the investigators draw their own conclusions. When she finished, the room was quiet for almost 10 seconds, which is a long time in a formal interview. Chen said, "Thank you, Sergeant." She looked at her notes. She said, "One more question, not for the record, for my own understanding. When you were climbing that ridge, were you angry?" Madison considered this. She said no. Chen said, "What were you?" Well, Madison said, "Focused." Timestamp day 3, 1400 p.m. The interview with Colonel Hargrove ran for 2 hours. The investigators had done their homework, and the questions they asked were specific enough that Hargrove understood by the end of the first hour that the investigation was not going to produce a sanitized version of events. It was going to produce an accurate one. He answered every question directly. He did not misrepresent his orders. He did not misrepresent the timeline. He did not misrepresent the decision he had made to hold and wait while the battalion's casualties climbed. He confirmed that he had been presented with Carter's assessment and had not reviewed it. He confirmed the order to stand down. He confirmed that he had not acted on the situation in the valley during the window in which acting might have changed the outcome before Carter did. When Chen asked him whether in retrospect he believed his decisions on the morning in question had been correct, Hargrove said no. He said it without qualification. "My read of the tactical situation was incomplete. My response to Carter's assessment was incorrect. My delay in authorizing action cost time that cost lives." He stopped. "I'm not telling you that to manage the investigation outcome. I'm telling you because it's accurate, and because if this investigation is going to mean anything, it needs to be built on accuracy." Chen looked at him for a moment. She said, "Colonel, in your 30 years of service, have you encountered many officers who would give that answer?" Hargrove said, "Not enough." He paused. "I include myself in that number up until approximately 48 hours ago." Timestamp day 5, evening. The results of the medical evaluation of Madison Carter's hands were returned on day 5. The cold injury had been moderate, not severe enough to cause permanent damage, but significant enough to require treatment and documentation. The evaluation noted that the injury was consistent with extended stationary exposure at high elevation and low temperatures, which was consistent with the reported 1 hour and 37 minutes on the ridge. The medical officer who signed the report added a single handwritten note at the bottom, outside the official form, the kind of thing that medical officers sometimes do when the official form doesn't have a field for the thing they want to say. The note said, "Patient sustained this injury while performing a task that required a level of professional precision incompatible with the degree of physical discomfort she was experiencing at the time. The margin for error at this level of impairment in extremity function would, in most individuals, preclude the performance documented." Worth noting, the medical officer was a captain named Ewan who had been in the Marine Corps for 8 years and had seen a considerable number of things worth noting. He noted this one. That medical report would later be cited specifically in the investigation's final assessment. Timestamp day 7:11 a.m. Major Rourke's interview was, by all accounts, from the people present, the most difficult interview of the investigation. Not because Rourke was uncooperative. He was scrupulously cooperative. It was difficult because the interview revealed with the particular clarity that sworn testimony produces the precise nature of the gap between what Rourke had privately assessed and what he had been able to act on, given the command environment he was operating in. Chen asked him, "At the point at which Sergeant Carter presented her assessment in the operations center, did you believe her analysis was tactically sound?" Rourke said yes. "Did you communicate that belief to Colonel Hargrove?" Silence. "Then I attempted to. He was not available." "At the point at which Sergeant Carter left the operations center, did you believe she was going to the ridge?" Another silence. "I believed it was possible." "Did you take any action to prevent her from leaving?" He looked at the table. He looked at Chen. "No." "Did you take any action to support her departure?" He said, "I attempted to contact her by radio before and after she left. I provided approach and LZ information when she indicated she had comms. I coordinated the medevac helicopters with knowledge that the corridor was being maintained by an unauthorized operator." Chen said, "You facilitated her mission without authorizing it." He said, "I could not authorize it. What I could do was not obstruct it and attempt to support it within my authority level." She made a note. She said, "Major Rourke, if Sergeant Carter had not taken the action she took, what is your assessment of the battalion's likely outcome?" Rourke was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was even and controlled in the way voices go even and controlled when the alternative is something that is not appropriate for an interview room. He said, "I think we would have lost the battalion." He stopped. He composed himself with visible effort. He said, "Not every Marine, but enough that it would not have been a rescue. It would have been a catastrophe. And I think about that every morning when I wake up. And I will probably think about it every morning for a long time." The interview ended at 12:47 p.m., timestamp day 14. The preliminary findings. The preliminary findings of the investigation were delivered to Brigade Command on day 14. They were classified at the appropriate level and were not made public in their complete form because complete investigation findings in active theater rarely are. But the summary, which circulated through the relevant chains of command and eventually became the basis for the actions that followed, contained several findings that were clear in their meaning to anyone who read them. Finding 1 Sergeant Madison Carter of 2nd Battalion had conducted an unauthorized combat operation on the morning of the ambush. This finding was unambiguous and factually established. Finding 2, the unauthorized operation, had been the determinative factor in the survival of the battalion's extractable personnel. This finding was supported by the drone footage, the radio transcript analysis, the tactical reconstruction performed by the investigating officers, and the sworn testimony of 41 of the 47 witnesses. Finding 3, intelligence information provided by Sergeant Carter to the battalion 2 weeks prior to the ambush had accurately identified the tactical positions used in the ambush, and this information had not been incorporated into mission planning. This finding was supported by Carter's range cards, the briefing records, and the sworn testimony of every officer present at the briefing 2 weeks prior. Finding 4, the command environment within the battalion had, over the course of the deployment, systematically underweighted the professional assessments of Sergeant Carter in a manner that was inconsistent with her documented performance and qualifications, and that had contributed to the failure to act on her intelligence in the weeks preceding the ambush. Finding 4 was the one that moved through the command quietly and settled into the understanding of everyone who read it with the particular weight of a fact that has been known informally for a long time and is now formal. Timestamp day 18. The decision. Madison Carter was called to Walker's office on day 18. Not Hargrove's, Walker's. She came in at 0800 and found not just Walker, but Hargrove and Ruark as well, which was a configuration of senior personnel that did not correspond to any administrative meeting she was aware of being scheduled. She came to attention. Walker said, "At ease. Sit down." She sat. Walker said, "The investigation is substantially complete. The IG will take several more weeks to finalize the formal report, but the command-level decisions are ready to be communicated." He looked at her. "Sergeant Carter, the preliminary recommendation regarding disciplinary action for your unauthorized departure from the FOB and unauthorized conduct of combat operations is as follows." He paused, not for effect, because he was choosing his words with the care of a commander who understands that the next sentence is going to matter to the person hearing it for the rest of their life. "The investigating officers have found and Brigade Command has concurred that while your actions on the morning in question were in clear violation of standing orders and military protocol, the totality of the circumstances, including the documented failure to act on your prior intelligence, the tactical situation at the time of your departure, and the outcome of your actions warrants a finding of mitigated culpability." Madison said, "Sir," he said, "you will receive a formal written reprimand for disobeying orders. That reprimand will be placed in your file." He paused, "alongside a formal commendation for valor." She absorbed this. He said, "The reprimand and the commendation will be in the same file. They will tell a complete story. Both of them are accurate. We're not removing the violation from the record, and we're not removing what you accomplished from the record either. Both things are true, and both things stay." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Do you have any questions about that outcome?" She thought about it. She said, "No, sir." He looked at her for a moment. "Most people in your position would have a reaction to this. You're allowed to have a reaction." She said, "I'm having one, sir. I'm just not having it here." He almost smiled, just almost. He said, "Fair enough." Hargrove spoke for the first time. He said, "Sergeant Carter, the commendation, and I want to be direct about this because I think you deserve directness, is not offered as a political solution to a complicated situation. It is offered because your actions on the morning in question were genuinely extraordinary, and because extraordinary things deserve to be named what they are." He looked at her steadily. "What you did was extraordinary. I was wrong to not give you the opportunity to do it sooner. That is the truth, and I intend it to be on record." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Colonel, what you just said in this room on the record, that matters more than the commendation." He said, "Good, because I mean it more." Rourke said nothing. He sat with his hands clasped on the table. But when Madison looked at him briefly and then looked away, he gave a small nod that carried everything he hadn't been able to say in the operations center on the morning of the ambush, and she received it as what it was. Timestamp day 18, 11 a.m. The word went through the battalion within the hour. Reprimand and commendation, simultaneous, same file. The reaction was exactly as fractured and complicated as the battalion itself. Some Marines thought the reprimand was unjust, given what she had accomplished. Some thought the commendation papered over what should have been a more serious accountability for the unauthorized action. And some, the majority, by the end of the day, landed where most honest people land when they sit with something complex long enough. Both things were true, and holding both things at once was uncomfortable, and the discomfort was appropriate. Corporal Jenkins heard the news from Torres. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "She's going to have a reprimand in her file." Torres said, "And a valor commendation." Jenkins said, "From the same action." Torres said, "Yes." Jenkins thought about this for a long time. He said, "That's a hell of a thing to explain to your next commanding officer." Torres said, "I imagine she'll manage." Jenkins said, "Yeah." He picked up his pen. He had been trying to write the letters to the families of the 3 Marines from his squad who hadn't come home. He had been trying for 17 days, and the letters weren't done yet because every time he tried to write them, he kept getting stuck on the same problem, which was that he kept trying to find a way to describe what had happened that was honest and complete, and didn't leave anything out that needed to be in there. He picked up his pen. He looked at the paper. He thought about Madison Carter on a ridge with one round left covering the evacuation of a battalion that had spent months not trusting her. He started writing. Timestamp day 22. Medical clearance. Madison Carter was medically cleared for full duty on day 22. Her hands had healed. The cold injury had resolved without permanent damage, which the medical officer noted with the specific satisfaction of a physician whose prognosis had proven correct. She returned to active duty status on the morning of day 23. Her Claude's response was interrupted. Try again, timestamp day 23. FOB Falcon, 6 a.m. She was back before anyone else was awake. That was how Madison Carter returned to active duty. Not with ceremony, not with announcement, not with any of the formal acknowledgement that the past 22 days might have suggested was warranted. She was simply there at her station before first light, with her range cards and her notebook, and the particular focused quiet of a person who has always worked best in the hours before the world gets loud. The petty officer who opened the operations center at 5:50 found her already inside, already working, and said nothing because there was nothing to say that fit the situation. He made coffee. He set a cup near her without comment. She said thank you without looking up. That was the whole ceremony. The battalion noticed her return the way battalions notice things, not all at once, not officially, but through the accumulation of small moments that each carry their own weight. A Marine passing her in the corridor who slowed his pace without stopping. A squad leader who made a point of catching her eye at morning formation and nodding once with the specific gravity of a nod that is carrying more than nods usually carry. The armorer who greeted her with "Welcome back, Sergeant," in a tone of voice he did not use with most people. Small things, all of them true. Corporal Reyes found her at 08:30. He was out of the medical bay and back to limited duty, his left shoulder still wrapped, his movements still careful. He came to her station and he stood there for a moment without speaking, which told her he had rehearsed what he was going to say and was now deciding whether the rehearsed version was the right version. She looked up. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You don't." He said, "I said things in the common room about whether you belonged here. I said them more than once, and other people heard me say them, and I want you to know that I know I was wrong and that I'm sorry." She looked at him. He was 22 years old, standing there with a wounded shoulder and an honest face and the specific discomfort of a young man doing a hard thing because it was right and not because it was easy. She said, "Reyes, you were operating on what you thought you knew. Now you know something different. That's how it works." He said, "It shouldn't have taken what it took for me to know it." She said, "No, it shouldn't have." She held his gaze. "But here we are, and the question now isn't what you thought before. It's what you do with what you know." He said, "Yes, Sergeant." He started to turn. She said, "Reyes." He turned back. "Your shoulder heals, you come find me. I'll show you how I set up the range cards on that valley." The methodology, because the next time someone in this battalion is going into terrain like that, I want the analysis done in advance by people who know how to do it. I'd rather teach 10 Marines to see a valley the way I see it than do it alone every time. He stared at her. He said, "You're going to teach me?" She said, "If you're willing to learn." "Are you?" He said without hesitation. "Yes, Sergeant." She went back to her range cards. Timestamp day 23, 10 a.m. Walker called a battalion formation at 10 a.m. All available personnel, FOB Falcon Parade Ground, full formation. This was not a routine event. Formations of this type, all hands unscheduled, carried a specific signal in battalion life. Something significant was going to be said, and it was going to be said to everyone at once, rather than filtered through the chain of reports and rumors that is the normal medium of institutional information. The battalion assembled with the particular alertness of people who know they are about to hear something that matters. Walker stood in front of them. He was not a dramatic man by nature. He was methodical and direct, and he had the specific quality of senior leaders who do not need to perform authority because they actually have it. He looked at his battalion for a long moment before he spoke. He said, 23 days ago, this battalion was in a valley that was designed to destroy us. The people who built that ambush were skilled and patient, and they had studied us. They knew our roots, they knew our assets, they knew our doctrine. They built something that should have worked. He paused. It didn't work. 11 of our Marines died. 39 were wounded. Those losses are real, and they are not minimized by what I'm about to say. But 430 Marines came home because one person on this FOB decided that 430 Marines were worth more than the career consequences of disobeying an order. He stopped. He said, Sergeant Madison Carter. She was in formation, third row, standing the way she always stood, straight, still the posture of someone who does not perform composure, but actually has it. 47 heads turned toward her at once, the involuntary movement of people orienting to the subject of attention. She did not change her expression. She looked at Walker. He said, Sergeant Carter spent this deployment being underestimated by this command, including by me. She produced intelligence that we did not use. She offered assessments that we did not act on. And when the moment came that required someone to carry the full weight of professional excellence alone without authorization and without support, she carried it with a precision and a commitment that saved this battalion. He said it plainly, not with the elevated language of formal commendations, which she would also receive, but with the honest language of a man describing something he saw and will not misrepresent. He said, I have recommended Sergeant Carter for the Silver Star. The formation was still. That recommendation has been approved by brigade. The formal ceremony will be scheduled in the coming weeks. But I wanted the battalion to hear it here in this formation because the people who were in that valley with her deserve to know first. And because the people who were on this FOB and did not go to that valley deserve to understand what was done in their name by someone who had every reason not to trust that this institution would recognize it. He paused one last time. We failed Sergeant Carter before that ambush. The investigation makes that clear, and I will not hide from it. What this battalion does now with what we know now is the question we have to live with going forward. He looked at the formation. Dismissed. The formation broke, but it didn't break the way formations normally break, with the immediate dispersal of people who have somewhere else to be. It broke slowly, people turning to each other, the low murmur of a group that has just been told something that requires processing. And through the movement and the murmur, several Marines moved in the direction of the third row. Delgado reached her first. He said nothing. He extended his hand. She shook it. Then Ortiz, the veteran sergeant from Charlie Company, who had pushed his element out of the tree line when the southwestern gun went quiet. He said, Silver Star. She said, it's a recommendation. He said, Walker's recommendations don't get turned down. Then Jenkins, who had spent 17 days writing the hardest letters of his life, who stood in front of her with his hands at his sides and the look of a man who has decided to be fully honest because he no longer has the energy for anything else. He said, I was wrong about you. I said it to Torres, and I'll say it to you directly. I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and I'm glad you were here. She looked at him. She said, Jenkins, you write those letters yet? He blinked. The family letters, for your 3. He said, almost. She said, finish them. That's the most important thing you do this week. Those families need to hear from someone who was there. He said, yes, Sergeant. She said, good. She walked back to her station. Timestamp day 31, the Silver Star ceremony. The ceremony was held on a Tuesday morning because ceremonies in active theaters are held when they can be held and not when the calendar is elegant. Brigade commander attended. Several senior officers attended. The formal language of the citation was read aloud by Walker, who read it with the same directness he brought to everything. No performance, no elevation of delivery, just the words and the weight they carried. The citation documented the events of the ambush, morning it in specific tactical language times, grid references, target sequence round, count effect on enemy coordination, causal relationship to battalion extraction. It was precise and detailed and completely accurate, and when Walker finished reading it, the parade ground was the particular kind of quiet that happens when a group of people have just heard something read aloud that they already knew, but that hits differently when it's official. Hargrove pinned the medal. He stood in front of Madison Carter, and he pinned the Silver Star to her uniform with the hands of a man who understood the full meaning of what he was doing, which included the meaning that extended beyond the medal itself. When he stepped back, he held her gaze for a moment. He said quietly, not for the record, just for the two of them. This should have been easier for you to earn, not the medal, The trust. She said, yes, sir. He said, I can't change what the deployment was. I can only control what happens from here. She said, that's enough, sir. He nodded. He stepped back. The ceremony moved forward. Afterward, in the informal dispersal that follows military ceremonies, Madison stood to the side with her range cards in her hand because she had brought them with her because she never stopped working, and Rourke came and stood next to her. They stood side by side, not quite facing each other, watching the dispersal. Rourke said, I've been thinking about the morning, about the moment you walked toward the door. She said, Major. He said, I want to say something, and I'd like you to let me say it completely before you respond. She said, sir. He said, when you looked at me and I said your name and then didn't say anything else, I want you to know what I meant by it. I couldn't authorize you. I genuinely could not. The command environment was what it was, and my authority had a ceiling, and that ceiling was real. But I also knew your assessment was right. I knew it was right the way you know something is right when every piece of your professional judgment is pointing in the same direction. And when you walked toward that door, I made a choice not to stop you. That was the right choice, and also the hardest choice I've made in this uniform. And I've been carrying it. She said, you made the right call, sir. He said, I let a sergeant take alone what should have had support. She said, you let a trained Marine do the job she was trained to do in the only window that existed. The support came when it could come. That's what happened, and that's what was possible. He looked at her. He said, you are a more generous analyst of that situation than I am. She said, no, sir. I'm an accurate one. He looked away. He looked back. He said, the battalion is lucky you were here. She said, the battalion is here. That's the part that matters. Timestamp 6 weeks after the ambush. The deployment ended. The battalion rotated home. The sequence of events that deployments end with the final missions, the handover to the incoming unit, the logistics of moving personnel and equipment across the geometry of a military transition happened as they always happen, in the particular blend of exhaustion and relief that marks the end of sustained combat deployment. On the last full day at FOB Falcon, Madison Carter went back to the Ridge. She didn't tell anyone she was going. She signed out appropriately, gave a legitimate destination reconnaissance assessment, pre-departure terrain survey, which was accurate, and she went. She climbed in the 3.2 kilometers in the 680 meters of elevation gain, and this time the climb was different because she was not racing and she was not afraid, and the valley below was quiet. She reached the rock formation at 2,340 meters, where she had spent 1 hour and 37 minutes of her life that had mattered more than any other hour and 37 minutes she could name. She sat down, she looked at the valley, she took out her notebook. She updated the range cards one final time, not because anyone had asked her to, not because it was required, but because it was the right thing to do for whoever came after her. Whoever the next Marine was, who would need to know what this valley could do and where the high points were and what the wind was doing in the afternoon when it shifted northwest. She wrote for 40 minutes. She was thorough. She included the specific positions that had been used in the ambush with notes on their construction and their fields of fire. She included the approach to the northern ridgeline spur and the time required and the physical demands. She included the wind patterns and the elevation effects on bullet trajectory and every calculation she had made in the operations center that morning, transferred from memory to paper so that they existed in a form that could be given to someone else. She included a note at the bottom of the last page that said these positions were used in an ambush that nearly destroyed a battalion. They will be used again if the terrain is the same and the opportunity presents itself. Know your ground before you walk into it. The knowing is not the dramatic part. The knowing is the work. She closed the notebook. She sat for a moment longer with the valley spread below her, the same valley that had been 6 weeks ago, a killing ground and was now just terrain, again indifferent, geological, neither hostile nor friendly, simply real. She breathed the cold air. She felt the northwest wind on her left cheek. It was 11 miles per hour. She noted it automatically the way she noted everything because that was the habit, and the habit did not turn off when the stakes went down. It just continued steady and patient, the way it had always continued through all the mornings when no one was watching and the work didn't seem to matter, and the notebooks filled up with data that no one asked for. Steady, patient, precise. She stood. She started down. Timestamp homecoming, Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The battalion arrived home on a Thursday afternoon. The buses rolled through the gate at Camp Lejeune to the specific atmosphere of a military homecoming, families on the parade ground, children who have been patient for 7 months, past the edge of patience, spouses who have held everything together and are now finally allowed to let something release. The Marines came off the buses to the sound of that release, which is not a quiet sound. Madison Carter had no family on the parade ground. Her parents were in Ohio, and she had told them not to make the trip because she knew the chaos of homecoming crowds, and she knew herself well enough to know she processed things better without an audience. She came off the bus with her gear, and she stood in the organized noise of reunion, and she watched it with the feeling of someone who is glad to be back, even when the back is quieter for them than for others. She felt a hand on her arm. She turned. It was Walker. He was in the crowd, which was unusual for a battalion commander who had his own reunion logistics to manage. He said, "I want you to know something before the paperwork of being home takes over." She waited. He said, "I've put in a recommendation that is separate from the Silver Star. A recommendation to the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School. They're looking for instructors. The kind who know how to teach terrain analysis, pre-deployment intelligence assessment, and long-range environmental data collection. The kind who can show the next generation what that methodology actually looks like when someone applies it fully." She was still. He said, "Your range cards from the deployment have already been sent to Quantico as a training case study, with your name on them." She said, "Sir." He said, "The response from the school's director was not a request for more information. It was the question of whether you were available." She absorbed this. He said, "You don't have to decide today, but I wanted you to hear it here, not in a memo." She said, "Did they see all of it, the full deployment record?" He said, "Everything, the commendation, the reprimand, the investigation, the range cards, the medical report, the sniper school performance record. Everything," she said, "and they still asked." He said, "Sergeant Carter, they asked because of everything." She looked at him. He said, "There are 260 Marines at that school right now who need to learn how to see a valley the way you see it. That's not a small thing." She said, "No, sir, it isn't." He said, "Think about it." He moved back into the crowd. She stood on the parade ground with her gear at her feet and the noise of homecoming all around her, and she thought about 260 Marines and what it meant to teach someone to see. To see terrain not as background but as language. To see wind as information and elevation as mathematics and time as a variable that can be worked with or wasted depending on the discipline of the person holding the rifle. To see the valley before you walk into it, not because it makes you invincible, but because it makes you honest about what is actually there. She thought about Reyes, who was going to come find her when his shoulder healed. She thought about the notebook she had filled and the next one she was going to fill, and the one after that. She thought about the 2 weeks of range cards that nobody had asked for that had turned into the most important 45 minutes of a battalion's life. She picked up her gear, timestamp 8 months later, Marine Scout Sniper School, Quantico, Virginia. The classroom held 22 Marines on the first morning of the Advanced Terrain Analysis module. They were all experienced. They were all competent. They were all in some measure people who believed they already knew how to read ground. Sergeant First Class Madison Carter, she had been promoted 4 months after returning from deployment, the promotion paperwork notable for containing both a Silver Star citation and a written reprimand in the same file which the promotion board had reviewed in its entirety, and then made their decision, walked into the classroom and set her notebook on the instructor's desk. She did not introduce herself. They knew who she was. The case study using her range cards from Afghanistan had been part of their pre-module reading. She said, "Open your notebooks." They opened them. She said, "We're going to start with a valley, 40 kilometers south of where most of you have operated or will operate. I'm going to show you what I saw in that valley 2 weeks before an ambush that almost destroyed a battalion. Then I'm going to show you how I saw it. Then we're going to go outside and you're going to practice seeing the terrain in front of you the same way. Questions so far?" "No questions." She said, "Good." She opened her notebook to the first page of the Afghanistan range cards. She said, "The most important thing I'm going to teach you is not how to shoot. You already know how to shoot. The most important thing I'm going to teach you is how to know your ground before you walk into it. The knowing is not the dramatic part. The knowing is the work. The dramatic part, if it comes, takes care of itself. She turned the notebook to face them. 22 Marines leaned forward. She began. The woman who had spent a deployment filling notebooks that nobody asked for was now filling classrooms with the thing that those notebooks had and always contained. Not just data, not just wind speeds and elevation calculations and firing angles, but the fundamental professional conviction that preparation is not a secondary activity you perform when nothing more important is happening. Preparation is the most important thing. It is the thing that when the morning comes that requires everything you have determines whether you have it. She taught every morning for 6 months. She was demanding and precise, and she had a specific productive intolerance for shortcuts that her students would describe afterward universally as the best thing about her as an instructor. She did not grade on curve. She did not accept range cards that were incomplete. She did not accept the attitude that terrain analysis was the boring part before the interesting part. She said regularly and without apology that the boring part was the point, that the Marines who came home were the ones who had done the boring part so thoroughly that when the interesting part arrived, they already knew every answer. They just had to implement. Corporal Reyes graduated from Scout Sniper School 14 months after the ambush. He had taken the course under a different instructor at a different phase of his career. But when he arrived at the Advanced Terrain Analysis module and found Carter's name on the syllabus, he sat in the front row. On the last day of the module, he came to her desk and said, "You told me you'd teach me after my shoulder healed." She said, "I remember." He said, "You already did, through 22 other people who have already spread this methodology through their battalions." She said, "That's the idea." He said, "I'm going to pass it on too." She said, "I know you are. That's why I'm not worried." She meant it. She was not worried. Not about the next valley, not about the next battalion, not about the next morning that would require someone on a ridge with a finite number of rounds and an infinite requirement for precision. She was not worried because precision is not a gift. It is a practice. And practices can be taught. And taught practices become institutional knowledge. And institutional knowledge is what the next generation of Marines inherits from the generation that refused to keep it to themselves. That is what Madison Carter built out of a deployment that tried to make her nothing. Not a legend, not a symbol, something more durable than either. A method, a standard, a way of seeing that outlasted the morning it saved an entire battalion and went on being useful every morning after. The quiet Marine nobody noticed became the voice that 260 Marines listened to in the mornings at Quantico, the one who walked in with a notebook and said, "Open yours, because what I am going to teach you is how to know your ground before you walk into it." She never stopped filling notebooks. She never stopped being right. And the Marine Corps slowly and not without cost learned to listen.